Hi, welcome to another session. We have been looking at cinema as an ideological practice. We've been trying to understand cinema from a nationalist perspective. We've been trying to look at different dimensions of cinema from a theoretical perspective. And last session was all about psychoanalytical theories, psychoanalytical film theories. And today we are going to look at another dimension of film theories, film studies. Today, let's look at feminist film theories. Now, there's a reason why I have put it just after psychoanalytical theories. The reason being that we are going to expand on the idea of gaze. So, last session we talked about gaze and apparatus theory because that was the two concepts that we focused upon, especially since it's very relevant to understanding cinema from a psychoanalytical perspective. So today we are going to look at cinema and the gendered dimensions of cinema, both from a production perspective as well as from a consumption perspective. So feminist film theory sort of has a very important name, and I'm sure some of you are already familiar with it. So we're going to look at Laura Mulvey. Laura Mulvey took the idea of gaze from Lacan and expanded it further to talk about the male gaze, which I'm sure you have heard at some point or the other. Now, feminist media studies, basically is very interesting, and there's been a lot of work in the area of feminist media studies, not just from about films, it's also about other media practices and media production and distribution and reception as well. So, let's now begin by looking at what Mulvey had to say about the male gaze. So in 1975, she wrote this very seminal essay on the male gaze. And she said that she was talking about films and the pleasures evoked by their, by the way in which cinema looks at the female body. So she said, let's look at two dimensions. Let's look at when we try to understand feminist cinema, or when we try to look at cinema from a feminist perspective, there are certain principles that one needs to understand. One is that one needs to be very careful about the discursive practices that you identify in a film. So focus on the discourses. What are the kind of discourses that you see in a film? The second was that she said identity is very fluid. Identity is constantly evolving, is in a process of evolution all the time. It is perpetually in process, and one needs to understand this dimension clearly. And then she moved on to talk about films and the idea of scopophilia or voyeurism. She said she actually focused on two aspects. One was, of course, scopophilia, the gaze, and the second was narcissism. She said, scopophilia, she said, is the pleasures that you derive from looking at another person. I have already said this in the previous session. Now, the interesting dimension that she added to it was the pleasure of looking at another person as an erotic subject. Sorry, an erotic object, not a subject. So, here, women's bodies became the erotic objects that are to be gazed at. So what happens when there is somebody who's gazing at somebody and somebody who's gazed at? Somebody is gazing at and somebody is gazed at. Now, what is the difference between the two? What happens? So when a woman is being gazed at by a man, the woman becomes the passive object of desire, and the male becomes the active subject. The male is the one who acts. The male is, the one who does something, is not passive. So there is a very interesting scene that you probably have. If you look up Laura Mulvey and the male gaze, you would probably come across this scene from a Hollywood film where there is a woman lying on a sofa and a man who walks into the room. So she is like casually lying on the sofa. Her body is the object that the man who walks in, gazes at. So the body, so it is so clearly placed in such a way that her body becomes the object of desire. Her body, she's in an extremely passive supine position. So this speaks volumes about how gendered cinema was, especially Hollywood cinema. So women become passive objects of desire and men active subjects. So they are in the subject position. They are the one who does, things, in a cinema, in a film. They become the protagonists. They are the ones who are the heroes. So the second dimension, so scopophilia or the male gaze, is a very interesting concept that she developed, which was, studied so extensively by later scholars. And the second dimension that she tried to focus upon was this whole idea of narcissism. So what is this narcissism? So it is the pleasures evoked as films present us with ideal egos that allow the viewer the pleasure of identification. I hope you remember what I said earlier about the mirror stage. So the ideal ego that you see on screen and how the individual identifies himself with the ideal ego, the alter ideal ego on the screen. So this identification also gives them some kind of pleasure. So these two dimensions sort of complete the picture where the male, this is especially important to remember that this is the heterosexual male. So this heterosexual male becomes or identifies himself with the active subject on screen, and then also identifies himself as this active subject who looks at the body of the passive object, which is the woman's body. And often this body is also sort of fragmented in different ways, because the camera would go for extreme close-ups to look at the female body. Laura Mulvey therefore talks about how the female body is an object of desire and how the male gaze is constructed in such a way. The camera therefore becomes a male, or the camera therefore is a gendered one, where it looks at the female body from a male perspective or as an object of desire. Now, if you have seen movies like Narasimham, where there are scenes which very clearly depicts the male gaze. There are several films. You might have seen a lot of popular films where the camera becomes the eye of the protagonist, the male hero, and looks at the female body as an object of desire. The camera therefore takes you, who identifies yourself as the protagonist, takes you to viewing a female body in parts, in fragments, in extreme close-ups, which sort of creates a kind of identity for this woman as an object to be desired, to be looked at, to be gazed at. So continuing with that idea, let's look at films. There are several films that you probably can think about when I talk about this. And one can also see how this whole notion is something that critics have been speaking about, and how Laura Mulvey's idea has been consistently been talked about and discussed. And we do see some shifts in the way in which this concept is addressed. Now, one of the ways, as Mulvey herself says, is the female gaze, another way of subverting this male gaze. Now, a film that I would like to mention in this context is a film that got released last year, The Lost Daughter. Now, this is a film which has very clearly, sort of identified itself, positioning itself from a feminist perspective. So you probably will have extreme close-ups of female bodies which are not polished and exactly fitting into the idea of desirable bodies. So such close, such extreme close-ups is one way of subverting this whole idea of the male gaze. Another is probably looking at female bodies from a feminist perspective, from a female perspective, or having women filmmakers taking up the responsibility of representing women in the right way, or giving them positions which are more as the subject and not as the object. So there are several feminist films that you can think about. Can you think about films, feminist films in the Indian context? Maybe you will give me the example of the film Pink, or maybe Thappad. There are several films, or maybe Sharni. I keep thinking about Sharni as a very interesting film that you probably can look at it from this perspective. Now, in contemporary times, we could call, there are people who call this the post-feminist phase, people who call this neoliberal feminism. Now, what are the ways in which this kind of feminism has impacted the way in which media texts are imagined, fictional narratives are constructed? I would like to bring to your notice the whole idea of the pink economy. Now, when you look at the pink economy, it is all about how creative industries is so bent upon constructing images which sort of agrees with feminist principles. Now, pink economy is also about how there is a whole industry that flourishes with this kind of messaging. Now, the question that one has to ask is it just posturing? Now, that's a question that we can ask again and again. So there is some kind of posturing definitely that is happening, especially if you look at how certain films address these issues in a very superfluous manner. So when it comes to feminist film theories, feminist film criticism, this is a very interesting dimension that one has to take into account. There are films that seemingly look very feminist, but as you prod a little further, you realize that it is just a posturing. It is just a very superfluous approach to gender, gender basically. Now, a film that you probably will remember in this context is The Great Indian Kitchen. Now, we always say that such films, when it comes to feminism, or when it comes to women's issues, it has to be women making those films. It has to, the agency should definitely rest upon the women. Now, interestingly, this film, The Great Indian Kitchen, is not made by a woman, but by a heterosexual male who has done a great job, I would say, of looking at the issues of women from the perspective of the kitchen spaces. Spatiality is a very important dimension in that film, and using the space of a kitchen. He has so beautifully brought out the kind of oppression that happens in an average regular Malayali household. Now, Thappad was a film that was discussed as a feminist film, and I would rather say that there are a lot of interesting points there which would probably help us identify it as a feminist film, but at the same time it does have certain issues. Now, what are those issues? The first thing that one has to remember is the concept of intersectionality. Now, when you talk about feminism, the one interesting point is how do we understand women's issues from the perspective of intersectionality? Now, do these films give that sort of a space for the problems faced by women belonging to different castes, different class, and different geographical locations? Now, in Thappad, there is a very striking parallel drawn between the protagonist, the female protagonist, and her mate. So both of them face domestic violence, while the protagonist faces it in a very subtle manner. you see that somebody who belongs to a lower class face domestic violence of a very physical nature. It is very brutal. Now, this concept that there is more physical violence among the lower class is a myth. Now, this was something that was perpetuated in this film, which means that the whole question of intersectionality was completely ignored by the filmmakers. Still, one has to acknowledge that we do have some great films which talk about women's issues, which tries to address these issues, and especially in the post-feminist neoliberal phase. Now, there are, a lot of problems like for example, as I already mentioned, intersectionality, or also about, giving voices to different people, different women from different social spaces. Now, do we give that? Do we allow such women's voices to come out in these films? That is again another question. And also about challenging stereotypes. Now, do we have women characters who challenge these stereotypes, who tries to establish new kind of subject positions? Now, these are all questions that women have to ask, and especially film critics will have to keep asking. Now, another interesting phrase that I would, or a term that I would like to introduce here is femvertising, where again feminism becomes a commodity. Now, in contemporary times, feminism is treated as a commodity, especially by media text. There are a lot of advertisements and a lot of content that is now available which considers feminism as a commodity. And any feminist filmmaker will have to break through those walls and try to create something which is which sort of disturbs those paradigms and sort of travels beyond the superfluous kind of representations of women and tries to address what is beyond. Now, apart from women representation, when I talk about feminist film theories, I also want to take it one notch forward and talk about queer representations in cinema. Now, again, intersections is very important, and one has to remember Judith Butler here. What she said about performativity, she said that gender is performative. Gender is all about how you perform the role of a certain gender. Now, this is something which is very, very important when it comes to queer representation. Now, how many of these representations are true to nature? How many of them come from? So, do you hire a trans woman to act in the role of a trans woman? Or do you hire a trans man? Or do you hire somebody who understands and identifies themselves as of having a particular identity? So these are interesting questions that one has to ask as we speak about these representations. Another interesting dimension, of course, just like feminism, is intersectionality. One has to be aware that it is not the same concerns that all people who belong to a subaltern identity face in their lives. So one has to remember them also when it comes to talking about queer representation. So in cinema, as of now, we see that there is very little content available, especially as regards to films in India, where the homosexual community or other LGBTQI community is represented in an empathetic manner or in a realistic manner. If you look in earlier times, it was all humor, it was ridicule, it was never about a realistic representation or portrayal of such communities. Now things have changed, of course. There is a lot of films which right now talk about such representations, but again, the question still remains about the agency. Who is making those films and who is acting in those roles? So as we talk about these things, as students of film studies, one has to be aware of the ideological dimensions. These are all different ideologies that you find embedded in films. Patriarchy gets expression in these films in different forms, very oppressive forms? And are you able to identify and write about them, or at least identify them? So we are giving you tools to do that. And I think just reading those texts itself and watching those films will give you a great opportunity to understand them better. So if you are interested in doing a study on a film, looking at the film from the gender perspective, there's an interesting test that you can do as a researcher. It's called Bechdel's test. So Bechdel's test is, it's very simple. It is measuring the representation of women in fictional narratives, including cinema. So how do you do? The criteria is very simple. The film should have at least 2 women, featuring in a scene, and they should talk to each other, and it should not be about a man. It's very simple. It's just these 3 points. 2 women, at least 2 women speaking to each other, and not about a male. It's interesting to note that BBC has reported that between 1929 and 2017, the Best Picture, Oscar Best Picture Award winners, the films, those films that have won an Oscar for Best Picture, only 49% of these films passed this test, which means there were only 49% of these films which actually had scenes which talked about things other than, about men, when 2 women were talking to each other. Now, I'm not saying that this is the absolute test, because it is very flawed also, but it does give you a broad idea of the absence of such conversations between women in films across the world. Are women not interested in anything but men? It's a question that one needs to ask. So once again, we were talking about gaze, male gaze. We were talking about narcissism. We were trying to understand feminism, feminist cinema, and male gaze and female gaze, and trying to understand what Bechdel's test is all about. If you are interested, you can definitely do it too. So, thank you so much.